My name is Luciana Lewis. I'm one of the pillars and also the moderator. And I just wanted to introduce my, partners into this presentation and panelists. So I'm going to start with Dustin. Dustin Shide is graduating with a PhD in sociology this spring from Syracuse University. Their research uses sociology and intersectional theory to understand poverty and the experiences of poor, queer, and trans people. Next to Dustin, we have Benjamin. Benjamin's a professor of anthropology at the State University of New York and New Paltz. He is the author of Cynical Citizenship, Gender, Regionalism, and Political Subjectivity in Porto Alegre, Brazil, 2018, and the co-editor of Lived in Religion and Lived Citizenship in the In-Press Precarious Democracy Ethnographies of Hope, Despair, and Resistance in Brazil. His research also focuses on class mobility, political attitudes, gender, sexuality, health, and religion. He recently co-directed a 3-year investigation of political subjectivities among the demographic sector, once known as Brazil's new middle class, focusing on perceptions of 2013-18 crisis, cultural memory of authoritarian past, and the rise of popular conservatism. And next we have Douglas Haynes. He's from SUNY, Carnegie Plus faculty fellow and core faculty in the program in public health at Stony Brook University and the Department of Family, Population, and Preventive Medicine at Stony Brook Renaissance School of Medicine. The research focuses on critical approaches to public health, especially critical and queer gerontology, and analyzes health disparities in later life, primarily with regards to Alzheimer's disease and dementia risk, progression, and outcomes. And I'm Luciana Lewis. I am a professor of Women's and Gender Sexuality Studies at University of Connecticut. I am also starting a doctoral program in Women's and Gender Sexuality Studies as well at Stony Brook University in the fall. A lot of my work is diverge both within queer motherhood. I'm currently working on a book chapter for the Meter Press, which is the second edition of Queer Motherhood, New Theoretical Perspectives. And the other side of my project is also on Afro-Brazilian scholarship and translation studies to expand how we think about what it means to engage with archives and untranslated materials, how they shape the way we understand global feminism's discourses. So welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm going to start with my topic is called Mothering at the Margins, Ballroom Culture, Kinship, and the Labor of Survival. And a little backstory on this paper is that when I initially submitted my abstract, I had a very specific way how I was going to conduct this research. I was going to look through different essays, watch films, but then I discovered that there are archives of many of the ballroom families and mother houses here at Schaumburg in New York City. So as a result, I kind of diverted from my initial idea. So much of this presentation is rooted on archive usage and what does it mean to engage with them. And I also want to begin with this line from Audre Lorde, who's one of the theorists I'm using to pair in this work. And it's this phrase, when the sun rises, we're afraid it might not remain. Lorde reminds us that survival is never a guarantee. It is shaped by fear, precarity, and the constant possibility of loss. Much of the political and historical significance of ballroom culture and mother houses in New York City as sites of queer kinship and class-based solidarity and survival has not been as explored in the context to what it offers us. And what I mean by that is like, what does it mean when we're asking, well, are there no roadmaps? Are there no blueprints of how we live, how we survive? What does it mean to rethink these kinship practices, but also the very act of practicing queer politics? So what I discovered through the engagement with your archive is that much of the blueprint is there, right? And I noticed there's a lot of intention. There is a lot of reconfiguration as to from the balls itself, from the organizing of the events, but also through the materials that they produce, right? Much of these print material. a lot of the ballroom community is emerging from Black and Latinx queer and trans communities, which is shaped by racialized poverty, family rejection, and systemic abandonment. Ballroom culture is often described as performance, yet such a framing obscures the extent to which it organizes material and social life under conditions where institutional support is absent. Archival materials, again, have guided my analysis. And one of the reasons why, in my practice, I'm very interested in the archive, because when I go there and I engage with the material of radical social movements, my own capacity to imagine a different mode of social organization is shored up. Audre Lorde's assertion that when the sun rises where fate might not remain offers a way to approach survival not as a stable condition, but as something contingent and continuously produced. Within the context of the HIV/AIDS crisis, this contingency becomes acute. The withdrawal of state support and intensification of social stigma required forms of coordination that exceeded individualized coping. What emerges in ballroom is not simply community, but a set of practices through which community is made possible. The ball community is defined as a house, which is a collective of people, frequently gay or transgender Black and Latino youth who share a communal life. A ball is a social event in which houses individuals engage in dance and performance competitions. The network of individuals who are members of houses or socially connected to house members is referred to in this study as the house ball community. Mother houses, they also provide a way to locate these practices, largely led by trans women of color. These formations reorganize kinship through ongoing acts of care, securing housing, sharing resources, mediating conflict, and maintaining social bonds. Rather than functioning as symbolic alternatives to the family, they operate through repeated material interventions in members' lives. In the sense, mothering names not an identity, but a set of obligations distributed across a network. And this is one of the flyers from out of St. Clair, for their Mother's Day ball. And I love how every single one of the materials that I looked at, right, there was this invitation, there was this extension to say, join us, become part of our community. But also they state what they believe in, right, what their work is for. And I also see this bridging between, lots of joy, erotic embodiment, but also resistance through this practice. Thinking about also the work of Kathy J. Coyne, in her critique of heteronormativity, it strengthens how these formations can be read politically. Coyne argues that queer politics must attend to those positioned outside respectability, where multiple forms of marginalization converge. From this perspective, ballroom communities do not simply resist exclusion, they take shape within it. The house system can thus be understood as a reorganization of social relations under constraint, where care and belonging are not presumed, but actively produced and maintained. It is with this organization that queer class solidarity becomes clear, not as a declared politics, but as a set of material practices. In ballroom, class is not addressed abstractly. It is encountered through housing insecurity, limited access to healthcare, and exclusion from wage stability. Mother houses also respond to these conditions by redistributing resources across members, covering rent, sharing food, pooling money for transportation or participation in balls, and facilitating access to services, which I think is something really important to highlight. I think so often we talk about the struggle of understanding that resources exist, but not actually having access to them, right? And what does it mean when community members recognize that responsibility and understand that they also need to facilitate what's it called? Not the access, but also to be able to get to the resources, right? They're not completely out of reach, right? So I think that's a big important part that I saw through their materials. And even like much of this archival work also functioned as like memorial sites of like memory and the community members, right? So not only through their publication, right, they celebrate the work they do, but they're also honor those that have passed. I wanted to spend a little time mostly talking about the House of Latex because there are so many that I could look through, but wouldn't have enough time. So the House of Latex, in particular, that I looked at, offers a very specific model through which to examine these dynamics. It was founded in 1989 through a collaboration between Ballroom Participants Engagement Health Crisis, GMHC. It emerges at the intersection of community response and public health crisis. Its annual Latex Ball, first held in 1993, is not only a cultural event, but a structured gathering through which information, resources, and relationships circulate. HIV prevention, testing awareness, and harm reduction are embedded within the event itself, situating health as a collective concern rather than an individual responsibility. I also, through the engagement with their archives, I discovered like lots of emails, right, about the House of Latex that kind of give us a structure as to how they're distributing their responsibilities, like who's going to be in charge of giving the flyers, right? What is the role of the children in the house, right? What are the ways that they create interventions inside of the actual ball events? For instance, words and music, performance of sorts, distribution of fact packs that had resources. So instead of members of the community looking for the resources would be handed in their hands, right? Through these social gatherings and through the events inside of the balls. Attending the materials that surround the latex ball further clarifies how the solidarity is organized. Flyers do more than announce time and place. They map participation, the listing of categories, the naming of houses, and the visual emphasis on presence and competition establish a framework through which individuals locate themselves to the broader network. At the same time, these materials often include references to sponsorship, community partnerships, and health messaging and services, linking aesthetic production to resource distribution. The flyer, in this case, becomes a site where cultural expression and material support intersect. The archival presence also of these materials extends the process across time. And in the absence of, sorry. This suggests that archiving is another part of how solidarity is maintained. By recording events, naming participants, and preserving visual and textual traces, these materials produce a shared history that participants can return and build upon. Memory, in this sense, is not only retrospective, but infrastructural. It stabilizes relations over time and affirms that these networks persist. House of Latex is also one of the oldest ballroom houses that still exists, still does work. It stabilizes, memory in this sense is not like retrospective, but infrastructural. It stabilizes relations over time and affirms that these networks persist. It also provides a critique of the structuring force of historiography, which I argue disciplines the experience of human duration. It asks its audience to engage with archival ephemera without time, prioritizing instead the liberatory effects capable of repairing a damaged structure of feeling. It is a place to exercise appointment and refortify the desire to engage in material resistance. Returning to Lord's survival appears less as an outcome than as a set of relations that must be continually sustained. Ballroom mothering makes this visible by distributing responsibility across a network rather than locating within individuals or nuclear households. Care emerges as something coordinated, negotiated, and uneven rather than given. Yet, Lord reminds us that, quote, "For once we begin to feel deeply all the aspects of our lives, we begin to demand from ourselves and from our life pursuits that they feel in accordance with that joy which we know ourselves to be capable of." Thinking about also the current US context marked by anti-trans violence, economic precarity, and just straight right fascism, this practice take on renewed significance. What ballroom communities and the House of Latex in particular make visible is a mode of queer class solidarity grounded not in identity alone, but in the shared management of vulnerability. Through care, event making, and self-documentation, they produce relations that enable participants to endure and at times to flourish within hostile conditions. And I think that that's a big sort of like the idea of this blueprint, right? I think it is offer here. I think of in times of crisis, we panic, we don't know what to do. And I think return to this way, how community can help each other, how we can organize, how we can also have joy in the middle of conditions that are continuously reminding us, that we're not expected to survive. So in some way, to read ballroom culture in this way is to also to shift the attention from what it represents to what it does. And what comes into view is an ongoing process of structuring social life through practices that bind care, cultural production, and memory. Practices through which solidarity is not assumed, but instead is made. So that's pretty much it. Get a good time. Yeah, 15 minutes. Okay. Like to go for next. Okay. Yeah. Doesn't go too fast.
To install.
Do you have a computer? I think
yes.
you can just is a USB-C.
I mean, my computer just has my paper, but the
plug-in, yes, it's right. So this, I think you just plug it in the side.
okay,
right there, right?
Right.
Yeah. Do you want me to pull up your
Yeah.
slides?
Or sit. You can just close this, and you can move this out if you need it.
Okay, it should be okay.
Where's this? Where are you playing the flash drive?
For the helps. I would. I think I've got my paper down to the right size, but I would welcome like maybe 3-minute warning or something when
I can do that.
otherwise I can't be trusted.
What's this little guy popping up here? Here it is.
I don't have my writing.
I checked it. I just want to be with.
Because I don't want to do that. I don't know.
That's
I'm sure it works okay.
Nice.
And also do the
Here we go. Okay, USB. Okay, it's this.
Yep.
Okay, and we're doing this one as well. What's this? Computer. Okay, I love directions. Okay, and we will just slide this over here.
All right.
Slideshow.
There's the mouse.
Reading those skills. Moving skills. That's great.
Oh.
Thank you so much. Much gratitude. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Ben Young, SUNY New Paltz, and let's see. Let me just make sure this is working. Yep, good. The paper, I'm staying on topic, but this is a more macro title, and my paper is actually much more ethnographic and micro. So here we go. Since 2017, I've known and have been writing about a large multi-generational extended family in the northeastern Brazilian city of Recife. And if you don't know where Recife is, it's up there. It's, South America's like this. It's basically there. And this is a family that I refer to as the Pereiras. All the names I use in the paper are pseudonyms. Like many working class families in Brazil, the Pereiras have a strong solidarity. They celebrate all of the usual milestones together. In recent years, they've experienced some upward mobility, more stable housing, access to higher education for the grandchildren, and the acquisition of many markers of a middle-class lifestyle: cell phones, flat-screen TVs, a car, even a modest country house a couple hours away. They also navigate the usual intergenerational tensions, which increasingly surface in online spaces. Some new tensions, especially around politics, gender, and sexuality, had also begun to surface in the family. I'm currently writing a book about political polarization that ensued within this family, the Pereiras, in the tumultuous years leading up to the 2018 election of extreme right former military Captain Jair Bolsonaro. And the work I'm presenting today is part of one chapter from that project. I have an arrangement with the family's matriarch, who I will call Elena, that whenever I want to share a photo of the family in an academic presentation, I have to ask her permission. So I did that last night with permission secured. Here is whoa, no. Oh no, this is so strange. What have I done? Oh, I am so sorry. I must have. Oh, well, I guess you don't get to. Here, I'll give you a really quick. I'm so sorry. I was moving really quickly during lunch, and I think I probably put it on the flash drive before I put it on the. Before I saved it on my computer. So my bad. Let me at least give you a glimpse. Here we go. Everything else I can do without slides, but you got to see the family. So you can see a little image of the Pereira family. If you're from Latin America, if you've been to Brazil, it looks like a typical classe popular, lower middle class, working poor family. If I had the slide, I would point to some of the individual people. What I want to say just briefly is there's a matriarch who is a widow. At the time I first met her in 2017, she was in her mid-60s. She has 4 adult children, all grown, who have children of their own. Those children, the grandchildren, I refer to them, were at the time in their late teens trying to get into college. Elena, the matriarch's oldest son, is a military man and a Bolsonaro supporter, the only one in the family. She has a daughter who is the only evangelical Christian in the family, and the grandchildren all got into, while I was first living with this family, getting to know them, all got into the most prestigious university in the city through an affirmative action program, and they're all queer. All of the grandchildren are queer. So I guess I'm not showing you any more slides. That's okay. Queerness actually hovers at the extended family's periphery. There's an effeminate uncle, Johnny, who lives across town but comes to family events. There are lesbian second cousins or several openly gay friends, including the bald middle-aged gringo anthropologist. When I first met the Pereiras in 2017, Everton was finishing up high school with growing anxiety about university applications. As I said, a few months later, he passed his entrance exam on his first attempt. Very big deal, got into one of Recife's most prestigious universities. At this point, Everton, this is the grandson, wasn't out to his family in any explicit sense. But that didn't mean his sexuality was unknown. Family members regularly speculated about the sexuality of the beloved grandson, noticing differences in his jeito, his manner, without ever naming them directly. I was living with the Pereiras at the time, sleeping in the room next to Elena's room, and she regularly floated speculations, questions, and concerns about Everton with me, as did the rest of the family. Everton himself described a growing gap between what he called his vida sumida, his out life at the university, and the relative silence that shaped everyday life at home. Some months later, Everton recounted to me how his grandmother, Elena, had behind his back effectively outed him to his father. Everton told me that rather than speaking to him directly, his father took matters to his sister, to his father's sister, Everton's aunt, asking her what had gone wrong, what had he done wrong in his son's upbringing, and saying that he was really sad, abaladi, and that he hadn't expected this. His aunt had tried to calm him down, or rather his sister, telling him that there was no point in treating his son badly, and that the world is already ignoring him and treating him badly. For a couple of days after that, Everton said, well, it was that thing, tense, unsettled. Lord, I've got the right. Okay, so I just was worried I had the wrong thing, a wrong draft here. Everton said, there was a tense atmosphere in the house. But no one came to speak to him directly. No one asked him anything. He said to me a kind of a pearl quote. He said, I know that everyone knows, but I think that they don't know that I know. What stayed with him was not just what had been said, but how it had happened, that this sense of being exposed without being addressed. As he put it, it's not for people to go around pulling me out of the closet like that. And yet at the same time, nothing was ever fully brought into the open. It would be easy to read this through the familiar analytic frames, through the lens of homophobia or coming out, or broadly as part of a narrative of queer suffering within the family. But I'm trying not to do that. It's part of why I'm at this conference, because there's a lot of stuff on kinship. There's something more ambiguous, something that, as I'm going to try and show, about hierarchy, bodily legibility, and the management of family relations. And we need a different set of questions. How is queerness lived in a family where it is widely known but not speakable? What kind of belonging is this when a queer relative is neither fully accepted nor rejected? And how do these relationships change over time? To begin to answer these questions, we need to look more closely at how the family itself works as a moral and social order. I'm drawing here on recent work in queer kinship studies, especially Lucinda Ramberg's argument that kinship is not a stable structure, but a site of both inclusion and exclusion, and an ongoing practice of managing relationships. In this family, belonging is structured through hierarchy, expectations of respect, dense forms of interdependence. People are closely tied together, spatially, economically, emotionally, and these ties shape how one speaks, how one acts, and how one positions oneself in relation to others. One way this happens is through the language of respect. In moments of tension, younger relatives like Everton are expected to defer to older ones, and disagreement with elders is easily seen as a falta de respeto, a lack of respect. In other work that I've published not too long ago, I've argued that this concern with a lack of respect leans some members of the extended family towards nostalgia for the years of Brazil's earlier military dictatorship, when there was respect. Family also functions as infrastructure. I'm sorry. All of this is tied to the family's class trajectory. The Pereiro's recent upward mobility is a source of pride, but it's also something that feels fragile and in need of maintenance. Maintaining dignity and propriety thus becomes part of how the family understands and sustains its place in the broader world. Family is also infrastructure. Resources circulate across the members of the family. Responsibilities are shared. People are dependent on each other. Separation from the family isn't impossible, but it's not easy, and it usually happens gradually and in a negotiated way. Questions of gender and sexuality intersect with concerns about hierarchy, respectability, and how one is read by others. What's at stake is not only whether someone is gay, but how that fact becomes visible, how it is interpreted, and how it fits or fails to fit within expectations about behavior, comportment, and family life. As the example with Everton shows, the family uses indirect forms of adjustment, conversations that happen around rather than with the person most directly concerned, without the underlying issue having been fully named. Which is why in this family, queerness is so often handled not through declaration or decision, but through ongoing practices of management. How is queerness actually lived in this family? Well, not through declaration or denial, but through a set of more indirect practices, forms of knowing, reading, managing, that rarely settle into explicit speech. One way to see this is through what might be called tacit knowing. Is that a 2 or 3? Sorry. 3. Oh, great. Tacit knowing. And of course, if you're familiar with Sedgwick's work or even McTausig at Columbia, there are some of the inspirations for this. As Everton put it in one early conversation, speaking about himself and his cousin, his queer cousin Andrea, he said, "We're not hetero and all, but within the family, that fact does not circulate in those terms. It remains partial, indirect, and unevenly distributed. Outside the home," he says, "everybody knows, but inside things are less stable. The result is not secrecy in any simple sense, but a condition in which something is widely understood without ever being fully named." For Everton, what draws attention is not simply desire, but what he calls his jeito, the visible markers of gendered comportment. As he puts it, "I already have more of that jeito, of that way, so I end up facing prejudice all the time. What gets policed," unquote, "what gets policed most sharply is not his desire in the abstract, but how it appears in his body, in gesture, tone, clothing, posture." I'm going to actually just link ahead so I can make sure I get the important stuff in. Everton feels loved and cared for, even as he is also watched and at times judged. The contradiction is especially visible in his relationship with his father, who he describes as protective and affectionate toward him, I confer, but capable of harsh judgments toward other boys or men with the same jeito. Queerness in this sense is not external to the family. It is lived within it under conditions that combine intimacy with discomfort, recognition with misrecognition. Everton's cousin, Andrea, who also got into university, represents a different trajectory. She's more explicit and at times more confrontational. She's willing to challenge her older relatives, call them out. She told me one time that over the years she's lost the enchantment of her family, maintaining ties of care and affection, but no longer feeling compelled to remain close on terms that diminish her. Let me jump to this. Apologies. So sometimes there is rupture, and one of those, and this often takes place around political conflicts. So in some of these exchanges, and what I describe here is exchanges in the family's WhatsApp group and individual Facebook pages. Remember, this is 2017, 2018, when those were were central, where the uncle, the military Bolsonaro supporting uncle, would post homophobic YouTube clips in the family's WhatsApp group. Am I down to 1 minute? Yeah. Okay. And the question is, do the grandchildren respond? And initially they did, but then they stopped. This didn't really produce a break for Andrea. Rather, her participation in family life became more selective. Some topics avoided, interactions shifting in tone. Let me just skip to my final paragraph. As always, I was way off, but all good. So what I'm trying to do in this presentation and in this work is to bring into relief here a form of social life in which queerness is neither fully acknowledged nor fully denied, but managed. And I'm trying to do it not using the concepts that I was trained in, homophobia, suffering, all of that kind of stuff, identity, but through management. Widely known but not fully speakable, queerness is read through gesture, style, comportment as much as through explicit declaration. Over time, these dynamics don't resolve, they are reworked. What we see is not the persistence of prejudice, nor the gradual triumph of recognition, but a form of managed belonging, one in which queer life remains embedded within family relations that are at once intimate, regulatory, and uneven. My last 3 sentences. This, I think, pushes us to expand how we think about queer kinship. Much of the classic literature, including the amazing Kath Weston's Families We Choose, has shown how queer people build kinship beyond the constraints of normative family. What this case suggests is a complementary problem, how queer people remain within family structures that neither fully exclude nor fully incorporate them, but instead sustain their presence through partial recognition, silence, and ongoing negotiation. That should do it. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Quite know how to do it. I bet you do.
Okay, I gotta close. Screen.
Thank you so much.
The hardest part is figuring out which way it goes in. Not a final here. I was like, if I can get the mouse, I get it. Oh, yeah. Oh, no. I just had the files pulled up. Might be better here. The folder. Oh, look at that. Okay. Oh, for you. You got it. Is this it? Yep. Let me just go drag it over. Yeah. Oh, that's already. Oh, perfect. Okay. I just need to, yeah. Oh, excellent. I got my notes and everything. Hello. You want. Okay. So I'm gonna set my timer up here just so I can know where I'm at. I don't get you chatting. Okay, great. So my name is Dustin Satterfield. Today I'll be talking about an in-depth interview study I did with poor queer and trans people in 4 upstate New York cities. So the title of this part of this project is "This has been my entire life of being invalidated, LGBTQ and poor experiences at the intersection of cis-heteronormativity and neoliberal poverty governance." Okay. So I have this overall question: what are the experiences of poor LGBT people? And we can see that, particularly for people in my study, that this was influenced by neoliberal poverty governance, of course, cis-heteronormativity, and structures of disability. For this project, to understand the experiences of poor queer and trans people, I built from 4 theories. So intersectional theory, poverty governance, neoliberalism, and queer theory. Intersectional theory from Black feminist thinkers encourages the examination of multiple intersecting, interlocking systems of oppression. Neoliberal poverty governance is the idea that the US does not implement poverty aid to alleviate poverty, but rather has these structures to maintain poverty and keep a class of people that are desperate for work and for money. Neoliberalism is the free market ideology that emphasizes personal responsibility and individuals taking care of themselves and only in their immediate family union. And then queer theory, of course, describes a variety of theories and ways of thinking. I'm going to focus mainly on cisgenderism and heterosexism. And I will be using intersectional theory to kind of weave together all 4 components of this to understand the experiences of poor queer and trans people. So, as is very apparent at this conference, the empirical evidence demonstrates that the overlap of LGBT experiences intersect with poverty. Queer and trans people are more likely to experience homelessness. They're more likely to experience poverty than their cis-het peers. And it's especially true for trans people and for bisexual women. We can also see the experiences of multiple marginalizations intersect when we look at trans people of color, particularly trans women of color. So what is actually normal for the modern queer family is economic inequality, which makes a case for the importance of understanding LGBT poverty as a broad social issue. I don't think I have to make that argument too much here. Disability is also related to both queerness and poverty. Despite harmful cultural assumptions that people with disabilities are strictly heterosexual or uninterested or unable to pursue sexual and romantic intimacy. We can also see that queer and trans people are more likely to be disabled than their cisgender and heterosexual peers. And we can see that poverty and disability are interrelated in that it is very expensive to be disabled, and also poverty itself can be disabling as we try to, seek healthcare and we put off emergencies. So increased rates of poverty and increased rates of disability in LGBT communities mean increased need for benefits or income assistance. And we see, beginning in the research, that access to services are influenced by LGBT status. So all of this comes together to inform my research question. I was interested in what are the experiences of poor queer and trans people, both in attempting to access these services and once they have been approved for these services. You might be thinking, okay, why welfare? Why cash benefits programs? The reason that I picked this to study LGBT experiences with poverty is because cash benefits programs, while the most effective, and I would say that poverty scholars would argue because it's one of the most effective ways to help people in poverty, it's highly regulated. So it's an exemplar for studying neoliberal poverty governance and understanding how poor people are regulated. The three programs that I recruited for were Social Security Disability Insurance, which I'll call SSDI or disability benefits, temporary assistance or TA, and temporary assistance for needy families, which is called TANF. And that's how it's pronounced for some reason. That is not apparent to me. So these programs are some of the most scrutinized, and because of that, they're one of the best places to study this. I will say that although I recruited in these areas, many people used programs that were not cash benefits programs, right? So people would be using disability, but also have applied for SNAP because they also need to eat and because disability does not provide a living income. To answer my research question, I looked at cash benefits programs used by poor, queer, and trans people in these 4 upstate New York cities. These 4 post-industrial cities have similar racial and economic demographics, particularly when considering median income and poverty rates. So they're an excellent place to study economic disparity. I utilized in-depth interviews to address this research question. At the end of the study, I'd completed 31 in-depth interviews. The interviews lasted between 30 minutes to 3 hours, but most were between that 45-minute to 90-minute range. I recruited in person and online across the 4 cities. I talked to people who were currently receiving, were hopeful to receive, or had been rejected from SSDI, TANF, or temporary assistance. For each interview, I audio recorded with permission. I transcribed using voice recognition software, and then I edited each one manually before uploading it into the qualitative data analysis software, MaxQDA. And then I coded it using that software. I also completed memoing throughout the process and often returning to earlier interviews as I developed new codes. To give you a little bit of information about who I talked to, I just want to highlight that regarding gender, I spoke to men, women, people who were other genders. One person said they were two-spirit, one person said they were unsure of their gender. Regarding gender history, about 14 people said they were cisgender, 8 said they were transgender, 11 of the interviewees said, neither of those words really describes me. And there was a large amount of diversity for sexual orientation as well. Because I asked these questions in an open-ended manner, there was overlap between these categories. Some people would say, like, okay, I'm an agender dyke, or I'm an agender lesbian, and that's what this means. And so there's overlap amongst these categories. It's also important to note the racial makeup of these interviews, as well as the disability. And when I say disability, I don't necessarily mean people identified like I identify as a disabled person. I asked, would you say you have a disability? And they either said yes or no. Keeping in mind that disability identity is a complex topic that I did not really delve into for this project. Okay, so the results of my interviews are discussed in these three areas. I break it down by cis-heteronormativity and its interlocking with the neoliberal poverty governance. I talk about neoliberal poverty governance overall and what that looks like for poor, queer, and trans people. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the interlocking systems of disability, queerness, and poverty. So cisgenderism and heterosexism were an overarching structure that I saw present in these interviews. And its intersection with economic disadvantage came out in a number of ways. Today, I'm going to focus on a quote that highlights worry about access and the scrutiny that applicants face under neoliberal poverty governance. So I have a quote here from an interviewee, and all of the names for interviewees are pseudonyms. So this helps address my first area here, looking at the intersection of cis-heteronormativity and neoliberal poverty governance. So I found that participants were conscious of and concerned about their LGBT status. For example, one interviewee, Matthew, who was a 28-year-old asexual, gay, and non-binary white person, shared that he was concerned about his LGBT status in his application for disability benefits. And he pointed particularly to to stereotypes about queer people. So when I asked, like, are you worried about your LGBT status? He explicitly said, yes, I was actually very worried about that. He said, I honestly thought that they wouldn't take me as seriously. There's stigma against queer people being dramatic. That's just a reality we have to live with. And that they wouldn't take my bipolar seriously. But I have been diagnosed, like I'm actually clinically diagnosed. I'm taking medication for it. And I was still worried they wouldn't take it seriously. So Matthew points to a couple of points here about neoliberal poverty governance and its intersection with queerness and transness. So because of the overwhelming scrutiny of applicants, he's expressing concern that his personal identities are going to affect how seriously he's taken in his application for these benefits. So he's both worried about having access, and he's expressing concern that the system will scrutinize him due to his queerness. The experience of interviewees reveal the mechanisms and impacts of neoliberal poverty governance. Interviewees describe precariousness, massive administrative burdens, the privatization of poverty aid, as well as the morality of work. I'm going to focus on 2 points here: the insufficient funds that people receive from SSDI, TANF, and temporary assistance, and also the administrative burden that they face. So Jim is a 22-year-old white bisexual trans man, and he describes here some of the mechanisms and impacts of neoliberal poverty governance. He shared how even piecing together multiple benefits and resources left him unable to pay bills, and he demonstrates the failure of benefits to meet the needs of people who are receiving aid, quote unquote, from these programs. So he says, I have even less faith in these things, referring to the assistance programs, than I did before. Also, as a note on the actual cash assistance and SNAP, I think one of the biggest issues right now that is putting people in danger is the lack of funds that we're getting. I'm supposed to be living on $218 a month. I can't pay my bills. I can't do all of that. So I actually do have Section 8 housing. And I literally just had a call before you got here from HEAP, which is an energy assistance program. So not only is he receiving temporary assistance, he's also receiving SNAP, and he's getting help with energy assistance, and he's still not able to make ends meet. So I want to highlight here the insufficient nature of these funds, which again highlights that poverty governance is not actually about alleviating poverty, as well as the administrative burden. Not only is he receiving multiple programs, but he's had to individually apply for these programs, and there's no communication between them. So finally, I delve further into the intersections of poverty, though you can see that it's present throughout the project. Work and labor in particular plays an important role in poverty governance in the United States. I've selected a quote here that highlights these interactions, as well as the emphasis of labor and cash benefits programs. So this is a quote from Jackie, and I think it really highlights all of the components coming together. So intersectional theory, and particularly how neoliberal poverty governance emphasizes work. So Jackie is a 33-year-old white lesbian who was questioning their gender, and they shared how their psychiatric conditions interfered with their access to TANF, which has significant work requirements. They were at a point of applying for jobs that they knew they had no chance of being hired at, just so that they could meet the work requirements, the job search requirements. They were receiving TANF after a failed attempt to return to work. That was following 2 years of desperately trying to receive SSDI, being rejected and appealing. And they said that at this point, they were struggling to get out of bed regularly. So Jackie says, I was heavy struggling with depression. I was having like a lot of periods of crying, of paranoia, and just the thought of like trying to get gainful employment on top of all of that honestly made me sick and spiral worse. So it was a lot. And I eventually no longer had the spoons or reprioritize. Sometimes it was like either the stuff for the requirements or like it was either that or shower or eat. So Jackie really brings all of these things together, highlighting the intersectional nature of people's experiences with these systems and also emphasizing the role of work and labor here. So in conclusion, this project brings neoliberal poverty governance and queer theory into conversation to show that they're mutually reinforcing systems. And it shows that it's important to center queer and disabled people because that makes those systems visible in new ways. The social location of multiply marginalized people, in this case queer, trans, and disabled and impoverished people, makes these matrices of oppression more apparent. Okay. So my work shows that cis-heteronormativity is embedded in the operation of neoliberal poverty governance, and this project demonstrates that poverty, as well as economic precarity, are fundamentally queer issues. Again, I don't think I have to make that argument too hard today. My work also answers disability scholars' call for more intersectional approaches to understanding disability and its disability experiences. We can see that the state's definition of disability as the inability to work is incredibly relevant to neoliberal poverty governance. Of course, policymakers should consider reducing the level of scrutiny and reducing administrative burden for people applying for these programs, as well as considering the intersection of queer and trans people who are applying for and hoping to receive these programs. So the mechanisms and impacts of neoliberal poverty governance are made visible when poor queer and trans people are disabled. And of course, this work especially matters in this political moment as we see benefits being cut and trans people being attacked. Thank you very much.
Hey, if you slide the mouse, yeah, and all the way to the
Okay.
right, yeah.
Okay, now I can eject it.
And that eject is this little area down here. Yeah.
Eject.
You also have slides? Oh, great.
Feel free to talk to you.
Yeah.
It was more important that I was awkward time.
Also, feel free to take a bottle of water.
Okay, this is all.
It looks low.
They're just in. Hi everyone, my name is Doug. I'm gonna also turn on my timer. Nope, that is my alarm clock. Not what's happening. Okay. So this is like theoretical background for a larger project that looks at actually the changing definition of age and the treatment of older adults across from the late 19th century up until now. Largely in the context of the dissolution of age as a solidaristic concept, instantiated in both chronological age, but also in things like social security and pension benefits. But in order to do all of that, I first had to sort of, when you do theory, sometimes it's like, oh, I actually have to make this other previous kind of tangentially related argument because no one's done that yet. So I don't kind of like four things. So anyway, so that's where we're at.
So at the beginning of her essay, The Servant Problem and Justice in Households, political theorist Joan Toronto remarks that, quote, while we have made strides in being willing and able to queer kinship relationships, another frontier remains in thinking about the family. Not all forms of family relationships are kinship or quasi-kinship relationships. Specifically, Toronto is referring to, quote, a kind of family relationship that remains very largely invisible, that between a household's kin and their servants. Perhaps performing the same limits to queering kinship relationships that she observes, Toronto doesn't actually mention queerness again in the relationship. So this is like the thing about queerness is like the first sentence of this article, and then queerness does not appear again throughout the like 20 pages of the article, which is sort of like a fascinating formal choice in and of itself. So the seeming failure of servants and other paid domestic or care workers to fit into the program of queering itself persists unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, at least by Toronto. But despite Toronto's stated and enacted limit to queering kinship, paid domestic labor is, I argue, not unqueerable. Indeed, it is already queer. This queerness is particularly fruitful to observe, first because it expands our account of care work to foreground the role of heterosexuality and its relationship to capitalist accumulation and the role of the welfare state. And second, because it presents challenges to existing literatures within both care theory and queer theory. Within critical social and normative theorizing, care work and other reproductive labor have historically been stories about gender. Women perform care work is feminized, women are caring people. Under capitalism, care work has been feminized, and femininity has been defined as maternal and nurturing, uniquely suited to performing care, and indeed inscribed on women's bodies. Feminists have long noted the exclusion of reproductive labor and care work from even purported liberating accounts of work, with no discussion of the household in either neoclassical economics or Marxist political economy, even as women's work governs the reproduction of the working and capitalist classes alike. Because of the centrality of this work to capitalism's functioning, it is the form and means of assigning gender roles and allocating material, institutional, cultural, and psychic resources towards them. This social organization has historically made the heterosexual family the normative site of the majority of care work, with women's unpaid domestic and familial labor complementing and supporting men's paid work outside the home. On account of its familiality and feminization, normative care work is private, unpaid, and effective. These central traits thus not only organize care itself, but define the contours of normative cis-heterofemininity and the organizing principles of the capitalist family within and for which that femininity operates. Thus, care work is not only about defining and organizing gender, it's also about defining and organizing sexuality. Like all norms, of course, heterofeminine care work was never fully realized and has always been constrained by class, race, and nationality. This kind of care work also remained historically and culturally specific, largely to urbanized industrial capitalism, and indeed has been seen as a marker of societal modernity. But of course, this sort of conflict means that it was never fully realized in practice. Even what we might think of as the height of the housewife era, the 1950s and 60s in the United States, about 40% of married women still worked outside the home for pay. Nevertheless, these ideals were promulgated in media and enforced by law and policy. For example, women were and still are paid less than men frequently because they, quote unquote, don't have families to support. By the late 1960s, however, real wages had already begun to decline and the family wage would ultimately disappear. It's just not actually possible to support an entire family on one person's salary in the United States. This is not news to anyone. Often not even on two salaries. So as this family wage disappeared, it required more and more women to enter the paid workforce, especially among members of the professional managerial class who had historically relied on a single male breadwinner's salary. This in turn required them to hire larger and larger numbers of paid workers to assume some of the former housewives' familial and care work duties. Not just the menial work of cooking and cleaning, but what Dorothy Roberts calls the, quote, spiritual housework of child rearing and caring for sick, older, and disabled people. Despite these material changes, however, the norms of heterofemininity and the family persisted, as is evident in the crises of, say, the latchkey kids of the 1980s or 90s, if you remember that, if you're age or older, the debates over working moms, and whether women can indeed have it all. These norms were essential to the neoliberal program of welfare state austerity that depended on the private provision of care, even as it made that private provision increasingly difficult, if not impossible. We see then, as part of this, the rise of family values discourse and the retrenchment of heterosexuality starting in the late 1970s in the face of both their material impossibility for most families and the systemic demand for them. It is, of course, no accident that this occurs as well alongside the rise of queer theory, and indeed it is possible to historicize many of queer theory's orientations toward the family and marriage in the context of the neoliberal retrenchment of family values. Before we get to that, we're going to talk about a bit the queerness of paid family labor. Paid care work is, I argue, a queered form of the heterofeminine norms of care work in contemporary North American capitalism, insofar as it challenges the three traits I ascribed to normative care work before: its familiality, its unpaid nature, and its effective basis. It exists at the disjuncture between capitalist material requirements for the family and the persistence of norms to both denormativize these practical changes while continuing to justify the ongoing erosion of prior practices and policies that made them realizable. In reaction to the strength of organized labor under US Keynesianism and the growing accumulation crisis at the beginning of late capitalism, the system demanded the erosion of heterogender and family norms in practice while rendering them queer through the persistence of those same norms culturally and ideologically. Replacing the wife and mother's labor with that of paid, frequently racialized workers marks both the employer and the employee as queer in their relation to femininity. The employer is no longer fulfilling her feminine obligation to her family, instead entering the masculine public sphere, while the employee is at once forsaking her own familial care obligations, similar and parallel to her employer, while the care she is performing for her employer's family is its queered public double, paid and potentially devoid of the affective attachment that should be the hallmark of wifely and maternal relations. So you have sort of affective unpaid attachment with wives and moms, and now you have nannies, etc. And this makes care sort of queerly transactional. Arguably, this also queers the man in the family who is unable to provide fully for his family's material needs and meet the requirements of heteromasculinity to secure a properly unqueer wife and mother for his children. That's sort of a whole other potential argument. This is not, of course, to claim that the shared queerness of the employer and employee results in equality or even frequently, say, something like solidarity amongst women. The queerness of the employer and the employee nevertheless exist alongside their inequality. Like other forms of more recognizably queer families, whether same-sex relationships, polyamorous relationships, or many blended and extended families headed by often unmarried women of color, in the US and many other countries, paid care workers exist outside the legalized family recognition structure, as well as outside state labor protections. Domestic workers obviously are not family members. They do not have the rights of family members granted under US family law. They are also exempted from federal labor laws around workplace safety and rights to organize. As Evelyn Nagano-Glenn documents, domestic workers are explicitly, like the explicit carve-out for US labor law. For many, their immigration status also renders them at best precariously protected as members of the polity writ large. What am I doing on time? This queerness lays bare the conflicting and uncertain status of femininity under late capitalism. So the tension that we see between care work as both familial care work as both normatively demanded by family values, but also materially prohibited by late capitalism, I think also devolves onto femininity itself. It exposes the tensions between the systems of gender and sexuality on the one hand, and the ever-changing need for capitalist class domination and surplus value extraction on the other. The norms around femininity, including wife and mother, become shifting and uncertain, with the need to provide for the family materially arising alongside the ongoing demands to care for the family. Similar to Eve Sedgwick's characterization of the uncertainty of masculinity due to its shifting norms under what she calls the Age of Frankenstein, so too do the shifting norms and resultant uncertainty characterize contemporary femininity. Of course, this relies on a longer history in which femininity and care work they've sort of always been fraught in ways that parallel and double the fraughtness and uncertainty around masculinity. The history of 20th century Western motherhood is one that alternates between condemnations of the cold and distant mother on the one hand and the over-involved, smothering mother, whether she's the helicopter parent of recent times or the domineering mommist figure of the 1940s generation of vipers, for instance. Anxieties about paid care work point us towards this longer historical dynamic in which the family serves to transmit the material system of production to the psychic production of classed and gendered subjects, and then back to the material intergenerational reproduction of family and class. In short, women just can't win. Paid care workers also occupy a fraught position in the popular familial imagination, often used to restore, the narratives around paid care workers often serve to restore heteronormative familial harmony by highlighting and correcting inadequate mothering, as in Mary Poppins, or they are themselves failed wives and mothers seeking to usurp another's rightful position, as we see in something like The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. This anxiety also persists into contemporary feminist theory with the debates over the relationship between women's paid work, the resultant need for paid care workers, and the relationship to feminist projects and demands for equality, freedom, and self-realization. In short, we might say that alongside the Age of Frankenstein, then, we are also in the Age of Freudian. Highlighting the queerness of paid care work allows us to interrogate the category of care and the normative empirical writings that have developed around it. For normative care theorists, the affective and maternal aspects of care are central to their normative value, serving as counters and bulwarks against the economistic and atomistic rationality of white masculine capitalism. And for some, the domestic sphere is also this sort of space of freedom outside the temporal structure and regulation of, say, Fordist capitalism, right? That there's no one actually surveilling housewives while they go about their duties. Their days are largely unstructured, and that this is actually a domestic space of freedom, very separate from the factory floor that men are exposed to. And yet this feminist ideal of affective care and domestic freedom is as much a regulatory ideal as it is a liberatory one for those who are able to pursue it. One bound up in specific times and places, not only of femininity, but also labor relations themselves. So we might ask, in what ways is the emphasis on the affective dimension of care an attempt to escape from its less wonderful sides, the drudgery, the unpleasantness, the dirt, the repetition, the stuff that Betty Friedan actually gets right? Must women, and which women, scrub toilets with love? To what extent does the emphasis on affective caring impose on women a demand to care more? And what does that look like in terms of material practices? What if we allowed or even exhorted women to care less? We can issue a similar set of questions to queer theory, bound as it is to a critique of family values that is itself a historical formation to the vicissitudes of capitalist class relations. How should we think of that opposition when we observe the historical and cultural specificities of the norms the familial norms that queer theory opposes? Will they translate? Is, for example, many queer theorists' opposition to same-sex marriage partly an artifact of US or Anglo-North American conservative definitions of marriage and family, as well as the stinginess of the US welfare state? If this is the case, how do we contextualize that opposition to same-sex marriage when discussing same-sex marriages outside those historical and national contexts? If the concern is not over securing greater, say, access to healthcare, then what is the basis for opposing same-sex marriage? Given that paid care work lays bare the longer durée of conflicting and uncertain norms for heteronormativity, how do we understand the nature of the queer critical political project? Can we also then interrogate queer theory's often voluntarist bias, in which queer theory focuses on those who we may perceive, or at least able to frame, as actively and intentionally resisting, and doing so in ways we find legibly queer? the extraordinary homosexuals, as Biddy Martin calls them, in contrast to the average women, who may have queerness structurally imposed upon them. And so in seeking to apply this to, say, paid care workers who may not be resisting in ways that we identify as queer, I'm echoing Kathy Cohen's nearly 3-decade-old call, not only for the inclusion of those whose sexuality and gender roles do not fit into prevailing hetero family models, but those who are not necessarily resisting through queerness, but rather have queerness thrust upon them. All right. Thank you so much. Okay.
Right. Any questions? Or just observations or sharing that, or
I have a question for you. That may be unrelated. No, and you can be like, that's beyond the realm of my research. But when you talking about like mothering, I was wondering, what do you think of like the, I mean, like the like queer appropriation of AAVE, and then like how the queer appropriation of like AAVE, so African American Vernacular English, that usually makes its way into queer language and then makes its way into like mainstream language. Have you heard like people talk about like celebrities being mothered? I see it a lot in online spaces, like Sarah Paulson is mother. And I was wondering if you've seen that and what you think about that.
yeah, I love this question because I think it reminds me of and I'm gonna step back like also, right? A lot of my work that I have interest is also like the way subjectivity is built, right? Or how we actually understand what the figure of the mother is, the act of mothering, how those become translated as a result. I always fall a little short of exploring digital spaces, but also the media, because I think that there is a whole other, I almost want to say, subculture and dialogues that exist in ways that I don't think we've tapped into enough. And I almost feel like I put that in competition with the right? I feel that there's spaces sometimes we're not merging them in order to understand that they're all producing knowledge and ways of how we're having conversation with other people in ways that we're still trying to make sense. What does that mean? So I am falling short on that. So I need to definitely look at that to understand, because I think it's really important. I think you know, one of the works that I'm interested in is like how we think about clearing the family and clearing motherhood itself by completely like abolishing everything that we know up to this point, just kind of removing and starting from almost like removing the ways that we think about kin, but also we think about strangers as also the other way that kin can exist through a care network. But yeah, but I love what you're saying. And I'll look right at that for me so I can look more. And if you have any suggestions, because I really want to know more.
I can email you about it. I imagine it's hard to study the digital things too, because trends come and go so quickly.
Yeah, well, and also the way algorithms work. And I think there's so much, but at the same time, I also feel that the figure of the mother and mothering, it's always in the margins. It's always like not taken seriously. And it keeps being molded and or kind of pushed aside, right? Or tokenized as a sort of like the figure to kind of bring the idea of the family as sort of this to remain a side of oppression within the reinforcement of the nuclear family. Thank you.
These aren't so much questions. We're short on time, but just things that, you know, whatever I want to say, an observation. I love the presentations, by the way. I learned a lot. Dustin, before I forget, there's a volume that came out about a year ago called Unsettling Queer Anthropology, and one of the editors is the amazing Margot Weiss, who's one of the organizers of this conference and is going to be doing the Amber Hollybaugh thing later on today. Anyway, that has a chapter, and I just middle-aged brain syndrome, I can't remember exactly. It's Eric something or other that's on kind of, it's trying to like rethink ethnographic work from a disability, centering disability, and it actually argues not just ignoring disabled bodies or ableism in the objects of our research, but actually in the knowledge that we produce. And anyway, it just seems like it might be worth taking a look at. You reminded me of a couple of points. Airing something rather.
But like when reflecting back the way that I did interviews and like breaking interviews up into multiple sessions and doing Zoom interviews with COVID conscious people and that type of stuff, like that would be really cool.
Yeah, cool. And then Luciana, we talked a little bit about this last night, but I want to say it again, which is, you know, I have no expertise in this, and like Paris is Burning is my main like data source for your topic. I'm being completely honest. But I am aware that even just in Paris is Burning and informal, you know, familiarity I have with these kinds of balls, there is discord, there is conflict. And I was teasing you last night that you must see Cat's the Jellicle Ball as soon as possible, because it's basically about your project. Yeah, you should see it tonight, actually, if we can get it. But I mean it seriously, because it's your topic is suddenly the most important, arguably the most important show in town right now. So, but anyway, what I was going to say is, it's a critique that could be lodged towards that show as well, which is that it presents, and it's very tempting to do this, a kind of a almost utopian view of these balls, that like it's like a queer solidarity love fest, but that's not really an accurate representation. So anyway, it's important.
It's a true, the biggest position. It's highly competitive. And I wonder if that sometimes it's the pitfall in general that so many of us have towards moving or practicing like queer politics or thinking about care and solidarity. Like, how do we understand what that means? And I feel decentering like the ego. But and it's hard, and you're right. And I think there is a danger also to kind of lionize the balls as sort of, yes, you know, this is the thing. And I think that's an adjustment to make even through the language of doing the presentation. And I think much of my observation is like understanding why or what is there to understand that they have created, that it has worked. And maybe it means that we have sometimes pick and choose from different models, right? To understand what a class solidarity really look like within queer networks. But absolutely.
Oh, yeah, sure. I can't wait to read more about this. And Doug, I was also going to say, I'm sure you've read beyond this, but just want to make sure you're aware that in Brazil, part of the world that we're both associated with, there is a long-standing literature about domestic care workers and their relationship to the main family, and they're sort of in it and not in it, and it's family as a microcosm, because all of the inequalities that go back to colonialism and the master-slave relationship are reflected right there in the white middle-class apartment anyway, so just
thank you.
You got a finger in that, good.
Yeah, and in like Singapore and
Awesome.
and like in the United States, right? Like we never went fully without paid domestic care workers. We just stopped talking about them, right? It's just like, oh, right, we know maids are there, we know housekeepers are there, but we just are going to pretend like they're not. Just like a very interesting way of like normativizing the elite. Thank you.
I'm gonna end the meeting here, so it seems like we're